Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone here on the island in Kiggins on Appledore Island, and hi to everybody who is joining us on Zoom. I'm very excited for tonight's talk. So let me start with who am I? I'm Jennifer Seavey. I'm the director here at Shoals Marine Laboratory. And tonight our format is a 45-minute talk followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. If you're online and you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab on the bottom of the Zoom call. If you're here in the dining hall, you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you. And Casey and I will handle the online questions and let you know, Ian. So I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Ian Owens on the island tonight. He is the director of the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell. Prior to that, he was the deputy director of Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in DC, where his responsibilities spanned the collections, research, exhibits, education, and operations. He has a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Leicester. Okay. I knew I messed that one up. And an undergraduate degree in zoology from the University of Liverpool, a little bit easier to say. Dr. Owens' work focuses on ecology and evolutionary mechanisms that drive biological diversification. He is a very accomplished scientist. And I actually thought there was one book that you co-authored that kind of summed up your research. And that is The Evolutionary Ecology of Birds, Life Histories, Mating Systems, and Extinctions. Seems to cover the whole gamut of all of your incredible papers. And he's also faculty in EEB at Cornell, where he takes grad students. So if anyone is interested, talk to him after. So thank you, Ian, so much for joining us tonight. And you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks for being here. Okay, I'm going to try a little bit of, this is two old folk trying to do Zoom, so you can watch this for a little bit. Oh, you think it's that one, don't you?
I think it's that one, and I think share sound.
Oh, yeah. Look at this.
There. Now, go back to the PowerPoint.
So go over there.
Yeah, and hit the display there. Yeah.
Just ignoring them.
Very hard to do on a small screen. Excellent.
Actually, that's showing the weird. That's the.
And then you can go up here and swap displays.
This is fancy stuff.
Right, like at the top of the.
I might need to be on
might
that
have to
screen.
be on that screen. Hold on, people, while we work this out.
Is that the swap screen?
There. Does that work for you?
That's good.
You got it. We got it. It's all downhill from here.
And that is a presentation for this evening. We've done the hard stuff. Okay, all right on Zoom?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about this combination of citizen science, big data, and how you apply it to conservation. I should start, like you should always start talks with as many apologies as you can get in there. So my main apology to you tonight is I'm going to talk to you a lot about terrestrial systems, despite that we're in this kind of, wonderful marine environment. A lot of the things I'm talking about from this bird research is focused on terrestrial systems. And one of the things I'll put on the last slide is how does this stuff apply or potentially apply to marine systems? But you're going to see a lot of land animals. Two stimuli for me for this talk and for the work that we're talking about here. The first is this type of graph. Now, this just happens to be about birds. And this is a paper from a few years ago, which is really demonstrating the decline in this case, bird populations over the last 30 years or so. And this is demonstrating that in North America, 3 billion birds have been lost over about a 30-year period. That's pretty characteristic. When you manage to get enough data together, you often get these 1 or 2% declines each year, which have been adding up over the last few decades, and you get these massive drops in populations over that overall period. Now, this stuff I think is important, being able to map how things like climate change, habitat loss, hunting and so on have affected these populations, I'll be straight with you. I'm not sure it is sufficient anymore. My feeling is we know a lot of populations are in decline. So we want to be able to, I think we want to be able to figure out how do we bring them back from decline. And this was the paper that stimulated me with respect to what it means to bring a group of organisms back from decline. This is a famous paper called Bending the Curve, in this case for terrestrial biodiversity. The hypothesis here is, you see on the left-hand side of this slide here, you see that black line at the top there? That's kind of what's already happened. That's like the 3 billion birds lost line. That's starting in the 1970s, coming down to, in this case, 2010. You're losing a load of biodiversity. Those three lines there, to me, are profoundly different patterns. The dark gray one at the bottom is what they call business as usual. That means that if we carry on using resources as we do now, not conserving things very effectively, then you'd expect biodiversity to decline yet further at roughly the pace it's been going for the last few decades. The orange line in the middle there is if you have increased conservation effort, and the green line is the one if it's a combination of increased conservation effort and we change how we behave in terms of how we consume resources. The green line is really interesting to me because before I started looking at these sorts of papers, I guess I wondered, is it possible to reverse the decline in biodiversity, even within my lifetime, and certainly within your lifetimes? These sorts of analyses suggest it is actually possible. If you got all this stuff sorted out, we could make meaningful differences to the shape of the curve, the shape of the biodiversity curve in our lifetimes if we can get this stuff together. And for the Lab of Ornithology in Cornell, this has really become a kind of central unifying objective now. We're a very kind of sciencey data-based place, as you'll see. We are now trying to get the data required in order to be able to inform both conservation efforts and use of resources so that you can bend the curve for biodiversity. And here's the curve we show quite a lot. So the red bit has already happened, if you like. We want to figure out if you can do that green bit in the next 20 years or so. That's what I'm referring to when I say bending the curve. So how do we do this? I guess I've gradually come to the conclusion that in order to do that, in order to provide the sort of data that's required to do this at a large scale, you need information for conservationists and decision makers and so on that's useful to them. It's not just saying, yeah, stuff's probably declining and so on, it's declined over 30 years. I think we need to be able to say, on a scale that's useful to a manager or a decision maker, that this is what's happening and this is what your management decisions mean, which means you've got to have a pretty small geographical scale and a pretty small time window as well. And those are really challenging things to do. Typically, as biologists, people like myself, we normally do very structured surveys. We get expert people like yourselves to go out, look at the birds or the fish or whatever it is, and do these very controlled surveys. Those are, if you like, the gold standard of surveys. The trouble is they're very difficult to do at scale because there's only a limited number of people like yourself that can carry out that detailed survey. That's why places like the Lab of Ornithology started using citizen science data, getting normal people. We sometimes joke, we call them kind of civilians, going out there and surveying diversity. One of the biggest projects in the world for this is run by Cornell, and it's called eBird. Have any of you used eBird ever? You've got to use it, or you're going to be thrown out. Okay, quite a few of you have used it. Basically, I think of eBird as an electronic or a kind of web version of a notebook. If you went out normally, you might note which birds you'd seen, the gulls and the swallows and so on. eBird is a way of doing that digitally, and therefore all that information is then captured, can be put together in one big database, and we can use it like, the world's notebook, if you like, and you can organize it in various ways. That drawing, that map on the top left, you see all of those little pale dots across particularly the land surface. It looks a little bit like, those maps that people show of what the planet looks like at night with all the lights. those aren't actually lights. Each one of those little dots on there is actually an eBird observation. So it's a citizen scientist seeing a bird and recording it in the system. There are now 1.2 billion data points on that map, which kind of is the first illustration of the scale that you can do citizen scientists. There's 1.2 million data points. There's 750,000 citizen scientists doing that. And they've been doing it continually, if you like, for about 70 million hours, if you just add up all that stuff. So that's a lot of field work. You can see how it's grown over the last couple of decades. It's grown pretty steadily, and it's increasing more and more now. In a single day now, per eBird, we can gather as much data from citizen scientists as we did for about the first decade of the project. So now it's kind of really growing out there. Do any of you ever look at a site called GBIF? So GBIF is good one. You should spend all your time on GBIF. When you're not on eBird, be on GBIF. So GBIF is kind of a United Nations site, global biodiversity informatics facility, which maps all of the biological data that there is for the planet with respect to species and location. If you look at that GBIF map, which I've shown there in the bottom right-hand corner, about half of what we know about the planet in this respect comes from this one project, eBird. So it's a really massive project these days. So that's eBird. The great thing about eBird is there is tons of data, and you can see that for quite a few areas of the terrestrial land surface, at least, you've got a lot of data. Look how hot the US is, look how hot Europe is. So there's some great areas. There are some areas that are about in the middle. I'd point out India there. I mean, the Indian birdwatching community has really taken eBird to heart and is really aggressively surveying their country using eBird. It's incredibly impressive. But then you can also see some other areas where there's probably a combination of not many people, certainly not many people using eBird, and in some cases, not many bird species. But that's not the case everywhere. You can see in South America, you can see some very rich areas around the Andes and the Amazon, where there aren't many records. And you can see that south of the Sahara in Africa, particularly in kind of Central Africa, not many records either. There's a lot of birds there. That just means we're missing species. What that means is this is not straightforward data to analyze. When you go out and you do a very careful transect up and down the rocky shore or something like that, you're really controlling for everything. You know when you're doing it, how long the transect is, how you're sampling and so on. This isn't like this. This is people going out, seeing what birds they've seen, different times of the day, different people going out, different habitats, different times of the year. It's not as controlled as a normal survey. So what we need to do is we use statistics to try to remove as much of the error variance, if you like, the stuff you're not interested in, and focus on the stuff that you are interested in. What that typically means is you need to figure out, you need to use statistics to control for how easy it is or hard it is to see different bird species, how good or bad a recorder somebody is, and whether the habitat is really open like this if we're looking for gulls, or whether it's like a rainforest and really closed if it's really hard to see different bird species. So use statistics to do a lot of that sort of stuff. If you do that well, though, the results can be pretty stunning. So now we're getting to the stage with this sort of data where we can do global models of where the birds are and how they move through the year. Here's an example of this. Let's hope it works. So this is for a species that you could see out there probably right now, a barn swallow. And you see the colors moving around the map there. Those colors indicate the abundance of birds. So when the colors are purple, that means there's lots of barn swallows in that area. When they're yellow, it means there's relatively few barn swallows in that area. And when they go gray, there are no barn swallows in that area. So what you can see here, barn swallows are migratory. So at the moment, that's the northern summer and the northern winter. All the birds go down into Africa and South America. Then they start to head back in the spring and they go back up into the north again. So what we're doing here is we're mapping a bird species, one species in this case, at a global scale. It's one of the first times we've been able to do this across the whole world. And the detail we can do this with is pretty impressive now. We can do these sorts of maps of abundance. We can do it on about a 3 kilometer by 3 kilometers square across the whole planet. And we can do it on weekly slices. So that means if you want to know where barn swallows are, for example, we would know pretty small areas, very finely sliced through time. Now that's proven to be particularly useful for creatures like shorebirds, for example, where you want to know exactly which river they're using in which weeks of the year, so you can protect them, you can prevent disturbance, and so on. Now I suspect that this is about the only way that you can do that. You need to use that really kind of messy data grab across citizen scientists, and then figure out statistically how you do it. What we wanted to do, though, is we also didn't just want to look at what abundance looks like. We also wanted to be able to measure in a very fine scale which areas of the world are doing better for a particular species and which are doing worse for a particular species, to look at population trends. Now that's hard. It's a lot harder than doing abundance, which is what we're doing here. Because to measure trends over time, you've got all sorts of other changes in the data that occur over time, as well as the bird population going up or down. But very recently, this year, we've just started being able to do it. So the graph on the left here is one of the first really high resolution images of changes in population trends for one particular bird species. This is for a warbling vireo. Now that graph, that image on the left, on the right, gives you an idea roughly of how it's done. And I'll just describe it quickly. This is an example. You've probably heard more and more people talking about using artificial intelligence and machine learning to try to figure out some complicated stats in environmental biology. The reason for that in this case is that even though we're looking just in the US really here, and we've got good coverage of data in the US, it's still a very, very, very complicated pattern. Also, in the US, we're actually trying to do this for about 500 species simultaneously. Now, actually, although we're ecologists, that turns out to be really big data. If you're trying to model all of those different observations across all of the US at about a 16 by 16 kilometer scale every week or so, 500 species, that's more, you're asking for more computational power than there is in the world at the moment. So you can't kind of crash every computer around the world and say, please just do my bird analysis. You need a different way of doing it. So where artificial intelligence comes in here is that what we do is that top right graph there is actually a map of the US with lots of different grids put across it. And what we actually do is, instead of just doing one massive model that turns out to be impossible, we do thousands, indeed tens of thousands of little models, because we can run each of those ones pretty quickly. Then we get all of those tens of thousands of little models, little in terms of how big the geographic space is. We stack them all up like a load of pancakes, and then we take averages through those. Now, because that is still a big computational problem, you can't learn it, you can't statistically grind it all through. So you use artificial intelligence learning algorithms to try to figure out how the relationships actually work. So this is really an example of trying to use artificial intelligence to break down problems so they can be computed within a meaningful period of time. Otherwise, each one of our analyses would run for years. When you do that, the results turn out to be pretty surprising. Now, warbling vireo is a species that before we did these analyses, everybody just thought, hey, these dudes are okay. There's nothing problematic with warbling vireos. That's because people have done very coarse analyses, typically using a whole decade's worth of results across massive geographical regions. If you actually look at that map on the left, there blue dots indicate areas where the warbling vireo population is doing okay, increasing by about 4%. The red areas show you where the warbling vireo is declining over this is actually percentage change per year. And you can see that for the warbling vireo, it's not the case that it's just doing okay everywhere. You can see that in the northwest there, the populations are actually doing really, really badly. So that changes your perspective a little bit on how to manage forests, which is where warbling vireos would live, if warbling vireos were one of the things you wanted to look at. And you know what? When we look at different North American bird species, as I say, about 500 of them, this is the most common pattern that you found. Previously, we used to think that species are either increasing or they're decreasing. In fact, only about 3% of North American bird species show that pattern or anything like that pattern. 97% of species tend to show these sorts of quite complicated geographic patterns. I'll just show you a couple of them. So the top left is about as close as you're going to get to a species that's just doing well. So it's in blue across the whole map. That's a bald eagle. Probably two reasons for that. First of all, bald eagles have been really pushed down in the past through a combination of pesticides, direct persecution, and so on. So since the US has been trying to conserve them, they've come from a very low base to a higher base, and they are indeed doing well. But look at those other species. The one on top right there is a house finch, probably quite familiar to a lot of you, the little red finch that will often come to your bird feeders. You can see that in the east of the country, it's doing great. In the west, most of the population is in decline. We don't even really know why that is at the moment. Similarly, look at the great blue heron, bottom left. That's the big heron that you see in rivers when you go across them on bridges and so on. In the east of the country, these herons are in real trouble, and we didn't know that at all before. Whereas in the Rockies and in the west, they're doing much better, and so on across different species. So by doing these finer scale analyses, we're finding the idea of, in the case of birds of North America at least, the idea that some species are doing well and some species are not doing well, it just doesn't fit. Very occasionally that's the case, but for 97% of species, there's strong geographic patterns for where things are doing well and where things are doing badly. At the moment, we don't really understand why. These analyses are only a few weeks old. One thing we have noticed, however, is these mega fires that particularly have been in the West, they seem to be having a really big effect on some of these forest species, is one of the hints that we've had so far, which kind of makes sense. And again, is something that people wouldn't have picked up in previous analyses. We can also use these sorts of citizen science data in countries outside the US where there aren't as many bird watchers, and to do things that are more specific than this. Here's one of my favorite examples. How many of you drink coffee regularly? How many of you drink coffee every day? Okay, quite a few of you. Coffee, so I drink a lot of coffee as well. Coffee, very widely grown, 2 hands over there, that's a lot of coffee. Very widely grown, can be environmentally pretty destructive if it's not grown in a good way. But there are ways in which you can grow it, which are far less harmful for the rest of biodiversity. What these graphs show here, what these maps show here, is an attempt to try to figure out the best possible way to grow coffee in Costa Rica, and to give the people growing that coffee direct access to that information. So the little map, so that's Costa Rica in Central America, that kind of colored in area there. On the left, this is basically a map of all the species that we call kind of conservation concern. So these either tend to be rare species, or either endangered species or rare species, in that they occur in a very geographically localized area. And the color indicates how complete an ecosystem is, if you like. So let's suppose in a particular area, you might expect to find 100 species of concern. If you find the completeness index indicates how many of those 100 you actually do find. So pale blue colors show you areas where you've got lots of the species that you'd expect. Dark blue colors mean you've got, well, in this case, you've got none of the species you'd expect. So across Costa Rica, you can get an index of how intact habitats are, how intact bird biodiversity is across the big area. Now what this team has done is they've worked with this enormous group of collaborators, you can see at the bottom there, to try to look at different coffee growing regions and look at how well they're doing with respect to protecting biodiversity. And you can find that the species for coffee growing regions that are in green, they're doing pretty well. For coffee growing regions that are in red, they're doing really badly. Almost all of the species have been lost. Using that, you can then go in to individual plantations across Costa Rica and try and say, these would be the ones to try to improve biodiversity for, to try and improve the way you're farming coffee if you want to have the biggest conservation impact. So instead of saying to kind of coffee growers, you're all evil, you should stop growing coffee, which I don't think is feasible personally. I think you've got to get a balance between biodiversity and kind of human use of resources. So instead of just saying all stop, you can say, if you guys want to be as kind of green as possible, these are the areas to try to improve what you do. And by saying that with some of these coffee companies, it's really changed our relationship with them. Previously, they were kind of, we don't want to see your biodiversity data. Now that we love to see biodiversity data, and we will change the way we're growing coffee in these regions where it can have the biggest impact. And even some pretty big companies like Nestle, which haven't always got the best reputation for these things, suddenly really want detailed bird data on their coffee plantations. But just remember something, this bird data isn't done by experts. This is done by citizens scientists using eBird. So Nestle are now changing the way they grow their coffee based on citizen science, which is kind of one of the things that we're trying to drive. Because also those citizen scientists have a strong relationship with that project. They want to hold Nestle to account that they collected the data, Nestle have made the commitment, now they want to be able to kind of close that loop, if you like. We're starting to do this with citizen science data across quite a lot of different projects now. So I mentioned before that the US federal government uses this citizen science data to figure out how it's conserving eagles and how effective it is. Also, the current federal government, so the Biden administration, if you like, it has a biodiversity plan, an environmental plan called America the Beautiful. In that, it's also using citizen science data to start to predict which areas of America should be preserved and what the health of the animal communities are in those areas. Now, again, it's kind of clever for a government to do that because by using citizen science data, they're not putting a bigger draw on their agencies and so on. They're using the people that are out there already recording this data. And as I've already said, organizations like that's Nespresso at the top, which is part of Nestle, they're changing the way that they're growing coffee in Costa Rica. Also, Walmart are starting to use this data, and they're using birds as an indicator of pollinators, actually, and trying to ensure that the farmers that they use for their products have got more pollinators on the land than they had previously. So these big companies really want this sort of data. So that's an example where you're using eBird records, people like yourself going out, recording birds, coming into a big data system. We're mushing that data around, other people are mushing that data around, and we're trying to get that used by governments and industry and sometimes local communities as well. In addition to those observations, I'd like to tell you about two other ways that this data is now starting to come in. One of them is bioacoustics. Have many of you heard about bioacoustic recording? Yeah, a few of you? Okay, it's cool. I think it's going to be a big, cool thing for surveying biodiversity, particularly in areas. Remember when I was talking about the terrestrial land surface, I was saying how, we haven't got many records from areas of from Amazonia and the Andes. We haven't got it for Central Africa. My guess is it's going to be very hard to get big citizen science projects in those areas. Bioacoustics potentially offers us a way to survey those sorts of areas. I'll talk to you about two aspects of this, both the fact that we can put this stuff on phones now and the idea of putting out big arrays. Do any of you use an app called Merlin at the moment? Okay, quite a few of you. You should definitely all download Merlin all the time. So Merlin is an app that the lab uses. It started off as the sort of app that if you've seen a bird outside, say someone came to the island and they saw a gull and they had a black back and so on, you could open up Merlin and you could say, what have you seen? I've seen a big to medium-sized bird. It's mostly white, but it has a black back. I'm on shoals. You've almost certainly encountered your first great black-backed gull. Get out of there as quick as you can. Now we've added a new feature to it, and it's called Sound ID, and it's pretty clever. What Sound ID does, if you have Merlin on your phone, you just get your normal phone out, start Merlin up, press the big Sound ID button. Now, just using that crappy little microphone at the bottom of an iPhone, which really is quite poor, and it's very attuned to our voice rather than what birds are doing. And also, it's got all sorts of software around it to try to listen to our voices rather than background noise. It's still good enough with a load of clever machine learning on top of it to recognize most birds that are calling around you. So if you download it and try it tomorrow morning, I would guess that you will pick up 80 or 90% of the birds around you, and it will tell you which species it is. Now, a couple of things are interesting for us about that. You can see that in a moment, I'm going to make the case that that's eventually a way, doesn't have to be on your phone, but on other devices. That's a way of surveying birds in places where there aren't people, but you can put devices. The other thing we found about this is people just love it. So we are getting millions of people downloading this app. Now, why is that important to the Lab of Ornithology? Well, I guess our core reasoning is that if you want to change the world, if you want to bend that curve, some of it is to do with data. Some of it is knowing the right thing to do. And I guess as scientists, we spend quite a lot of our time trying to figure out how biology works, and if you were going to change it, how you would change it. So we know the answer, if you like, scientifically. But there's another thing as well. Just because we know the answer to something doesn't mean to say the rest of the population is going to do it, particularly if it's a bit painful. Think about climate change at the moment. We probably know we should be burning less gas and so on and using more wind turbines. Population is doing it quite slowly because it's difficult and a bit painful. So we believe you've also got to get people interested in this stuff and valuing nature as well as knowing the right answer, if you like. Merlin has turned out to be probably at the moment our best way of doing this. What this little graph here shows you is we launched this thing in June last year, and now in May. The blue bars show you the gradual uptake in people using this. In any particular month at the moment, which is shown on the left-hand kind of vertical axis, right now you've got about coming up to 1.5 million people using Merlin each month. Most days we've got hundreds of thousands of people using Merlin. The red line shows you how many bird species they're identifying by doing this. And at the moment, just in this May, which has just gone, we're coming up to 45 million birds identified using Merlin. So people are kind of starting to use this like a real social media app, if you like. Now, I would like it to be far more than 1.5 million people using it. My guess is just in the US, there's probably, the total number of people that have downloaded Merlin is about 10 million people. My guess is in North America, there are about 40 million people that are into birds. So one of our objectives is to try to get at least all of those people using an app like Merlin and using something like Sound ID. And the fact that it can do this kind of almost miraculous identification of birds, even in a kind of spring forest when all the warblers are singing, and boy, even for a very experienced ornithologist, it's hard. Merlin can typically identify the species straight off. So people are enjoying this stuff. What's it based on? It's again based on a combination of citizen science and very fancy machine learning statistics. You see all the green dots on this graph, on this map, top left there. These are about 1 million recordings of birds that are being made by citizen scientists. 1 million recordings of birds, and then all lodged with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in a place called the Macaulay Library. Now that's really important because if you're wanting to train your computer to recognize, let's say a catbird, which is a pretty hard one to teach it actually, then what you need for that is you need about 100 good recordings of catbirds, and you print out a little thing called a sonogram there on the bottom right hand corner, which along the x-axis is time and on the vertical axis is frequency. So it's kind of telling you whether a call is kind of or high, beep, or low, boop, and so on. And what you need to do is you find the bit that refers to the catbird and you draw a little box around that. And you need to keep doing that and doing that and doing that until you've described to the computer, this is what a catbird song looks like on the sonograph, if you like. You need to do that at least 100 times for the catbird, and then you need to do it for at least 100 times for any other bird that you're trying to compare it with. So 100 times for a catbird, 100 times for American robin, 100 times for an American goldfinch, and so on. So you need a lot of recordings. Again, even all the bird scientists in the world can't get enough recordings. The only way we've been able to do this is by using citizen scientists going out, recording birds and drawing the boxes around these sorts of things that we can then use artificial intelligence algorithms to train to figure out that's a catbird and that's an American robin and so on. We use exactly the same algorithms as this, as somebody like Amazon, for example, would use to classify the objects that they're trying to sell, to figure out what's in those images. Or when a computer asks you, "Are you a robot?" shows you those crazy photos, says, "Is there a lamppost in here?" and so on. We can do that visually. You can also do it using machine learning. We use exactly the same algorithms as they use for that. So this again is a huge citizen science, artificial intelligence, statistical problem. And only now can we bring all of those things at this sort of scale. So we've done this now for North America, a few hundred species we can recognize there, and for Europe, because in those two regions, there were enough citizen scientists to do all of these recordings. There are still some areas of the world where we don't have enough recordings. And therefore, we can't yet do a really cool version of Merlin, somewhere like Chile, for example, or Colombia. Amazing places of the world that we would love to be able to do bioacoustic recognition there. But so far, the citizen scientists of the world haven't recorded enough. One of the things that's really surprised us is when we've released Merlin in North America and Europe, the response to that in Chile and in Colombia and in India and several other countries has been, we're going to do it here as well. So now the citizen scientists in these countries are mobilizing themselves to go out, do the recordings required to get 100 recordings of the key species, then doing the annotations, putting the little boxes around them, so they can create a tool to do bioacoustic recording even in these sorts of places. It's an amazing citizen science response when you think about it. Let's go out there and get the data required to create these sorts of tools so we can survey those habitats. These are the organizations laid across a global map that are doing that sort of thing at the moment, creating community-led recording projects and community-led eBird projects so they can survey their birds for their reasons, if you like. And again, I think that's one of the things that, as kind of citizen science type labs, to me, that's one of the objectives. We shouldn't be trying to do all of this stuff from Cornell or from New Hampshire or wherever it should be. We should be, in some cases, trying to make it possible and easy to do that. But the communities are the ones who really know what they need to know. Now, of course, the next stage of this is going to be trying to put these sorts of recorders across regions of the world where we haven't been able to survey previously. This is the biggest example that we've done so far. That little map on the right, that you can see San Francisco there with that little black dot. So that's the Sierra Nevada, the mountains through the middle of California. Each one of those, so the green are the natural forests there, the blue, each one of those is a little recorder. It's not actually, and you could use, nowadays, you could use an iPhone, but we actually have made a little thing called the Swift recorder, which is a cheaper version of an iPhone, if you like, because it doesn't need all the other fancy stuff, has a bigger battery, is more resistant to being out in the wilds for ages. So one of these Swift recorders currently costs about $200. We'd like to get them down to about $20 really. But anyway, they're about $200. We've put 2,000 of them throughout the Sierra Nevada. So we are surveying, we are listening all the way through the Sierra Nevada. Now, the reason we originally did this is there's a species called the southern spotted owl, which is a pretty rare species of owl, and it was disappearing from this area. Nobody knew why, didn't know what was happening. It turns out that it's being predated by a species that quite a lot of you have probably seen, a barred owl, which you could see in your garden or in a park or something. The barred owl was coming into the Sierra Nevada and was attacking and displacing the southern spotted owl. By doing this bioacoustic recording, you can spot what happens. You can see that, in an area there are southern spotted owls to begin with, but then the barred owls, because they make a different sound, the barred owls come up, and as the barred owls appear, these things disappear. Now, recently we've done an experiment where we've actually removed the barred owls again, and you've seen the spotted owls come back again. So you managed to get a substantial increase in southern spotted owls by removing those barred owls. So you can do conservation experiments at quite a large scale. The other thing is that started off just trying to recognize a spotted owl and a barred owl. Now we can recognize about 400 bird species across the Sierra Nevada. So you can basically do kind of surveys of the biodiversity of these high elevation mountains. Also started using it for amphibians and even starting to use it for mammals as well. So this is one of the first cases that I know where we're really starting to survey big, difficult areas of the planet using big bioacoustic arrays. Now, this is an example where people have used this sort of technique in marine environments a lot. This is an example where bioacoustic recording was used to survey whale population between the two islands of New Zealand. By putting out this series of recorders here and demonstrating that there were both courtship songs and feeding songs from blue whales, they were able to demonstrate that this population of blue whales just off New Zealand is a really distinct population from the other side of the Pacific. Eventually, using that approach, the local communities managed to stop some pretty big marine seabed mining licenses by demonstrating that this whales was a separate population. Again, that's kind of bioacoustic recording being picked up by the communities and being used for conservation action. One of the things I think is most remarkable is that whales aren't the only thing that sing in the oceans. It looks like, well, certainly many species of fish also sing in the oceans. This is a recent paper, that one that's Rice, Ian et al., demonstrating that amongst teleost fishes, so kind of bony, amongst bony fishes, basically, there looks as though there's sound production, which is basically calls and grunts and so on, amongst about 175 families of fish. It probably evolved 150 million years ago, and now it's evolved 30 odd times. So it turns out that fish also sing, and I'm really excited about the prospects of using bioacoustic recording to try to survey fish as well. Okay, very quickly, the last example I was going to use. We talked about using humans to go out and survey birds. That's an example where we're using bioacoustic recorders. The other thing we're using is radar. That top map there in the top left shows the radar all across North America. What we've been doing is we've been combining, so radar was initially devised to look at aircraft, then it started getting used started getting used to look at weather, and now we're using it to look at birds. It turns out that radar is really good for looking at birds. So when you've got all those kind of little blobs in the background of a plane radar, those are mostly birds in the spring and the autumn, and we can separate that out from other things. So what we do is we combine radar data with the weather forecasts to produce maps of how birds are moving across entire continents, often at several thousand feet. These are some, based on that, these are some estimates of how many birds are moving up and down the planet, up and down North America. You can see about 3.5 billion birds come into North America in the spring. About 2.5 billion of those go through into Canada, 4 billion come back, and 4.7 billion go back into Central America. So you get vast movements of birds each year. Sometimes you can get 500 million birds moving over an area like Texas every night. Here's an example of what that looks like live. Using radar forecasts, we can now figure out how the birds are moving through America on a particular night. You can see that on this particular night, about 750 million birds are moving through, particularly through those Gulf states. Now, in one way, that's amazing to know that. The trouble is that they're very vulnerable when they're doing that. They're particularly vulnerable. You can see the different things that can kill them. Residences, 253 million, and gradually going up to these big buildings, about 340 million birds are dying each year by hitting these buildings. We've done some analyses to figure out which are the key towns, which are the towns where most of these buildings are being, where most of these deaths are occurring. And what we've started doing is trying to influence the people that live in these towns and own these buildings. Here's an example of this. We've created an app that calculates how many birds are flying over your town tonight, say Dallas or Houston or somewhere like that, and saying, this is the big night. It's not, remember, like with the coffee, you don't have to get rid of all coffee. You just have to focus on the areas where there's the biggest impact. Same with Texas, for example. Hundreds of millions of birds flying through, hundreds of thousands dying, certainly each year. You don't have to turn off the lights in those towns every night of the year. We calculated if you turn out the lights 8 times, the biggest 8 nights of the year, you'll drastically, hugely reduce the number of birds that are being hit. There's so many birds go on the same night. So the challenge for Texas is just turn out your lights for 8 days. But could that be done? We gave them lots of information about how many birds were in flight each night and which ones were likely to be, which species were likely to be there. So they had this nice picture of them. And they really did it. Entire cities in Texas turned out almost all their lights at night throughout their business districts. Each one of these pictures, when it's lit up, so in the top left, this is going to be Dallas. That's what it looks like normally. That's what it looked like after they turned them out. The bottom right there is Houston, again lit up and in the dark. When they're lit up, they are really a magnet for birds that are flying over. And when the birds get in there, they hit the buildings on the night. Then if they don't hit the buildings that night, they tend to roost somewhere in the streets. And when they try and get out in the morning, they hit other buildings. They get predated, they hit cars and so on. So these cities really are big killers on those nights. But these communities have turned them out, and they're doing it repeatedly year after year. It's an amazing effect. So to me, that's, if you like, a different sort of citizen science. You do this amazing radar stuff. You figure out there are 100 millions of birds flying around in the place. But then the people that live in the cities decide, we're going to turn out all the lights in this city for 8 nights of the year. I would guess they're probably saving, I would guess it won't be less than 250,000 bird lives a year by doing that. When you start calculating back that to 3 billion birds lost, you can say that some of these interventions are probably of the scale we need to start bending that curve, but you need a combination of them. So what's my kind of summary of citizen science? I would say that it tends to create very messy data, But there are now statistical techniques to be able to deal with that data. And you could use those techniques. These techniques are not beyond the sort of things that you guys are going to be using in your, particularly if you go on to graduate school and so on. By using these techniques, you can provide very, very fine scale data so that Texans want to turn out their lights. They know it's their city that's killing the birds. Nestle want to change their coffee practice, and so on. Also, my guess is that at the moment, a lot of our work is based on traditional citizen science. My guess is that when we start this bioacoustic recordings, both in terrestrial surfaces and in marine environments, this will open up even more data. Because at the moment, you kind of need a person to be there all the time looking at the bird. By putting out these bioacoustic recorders, like in the Sierra Nevada, we can leave them running 24/7 for years. Potentially a more efficient way of surveying. I guess if I had, one of my biggest worries about this at the moment is so much of it is based on the terrestrial land surface because humans are there. So citizen science is rather connected to humans at the moment. So I'm really interested in ways that you can break that link, like the bioacoustic recording. So you can enable citizens to do science even when there aren't citizens there all the time. And the marine environment and some of those tropical forests are the places we would most like to have this sort of data. Is there a way that we can get it? Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Questions?
One of the beginning figures, one you said that looked like is the lights were on the night on the globe. I saw, and that was like bird sightings or a bunch in the ocean. Are people on boats seeing them, or why are there dogs there?
Yeah, so they are.
Repeat the question.
So the question is, when there was that map right at the beginning of 1.2 billion dots across the planet, most of them are on land, but not all of them are on land. Some of them are in the sea and some of them are even kind of trails through the sea. Yeah, some people are doing citizen science from boats. We were actually talking about it just at lunchtime today. And I guess what I hadn't actually realized till today is people are starting to find good locations in the ocean. So like census points, go out, what's the shelf called? Jeffrey's Ledge would be a classic place. They're using that as a location, like you might use Yellowstone National Park and do the survey there. If people did that on this type of data, that would just be mind-blowing. Because we haven't, I'm not aware of that sort of data across that sort of scale. So I think that would be really cool. And coming here actually has made me think a lot more about how you might promote that.
I think there's a lot of shipping lanes in that.
Yeah.
People sitting on big cargo ships, perhaps, as Casey said, bored out of their minds, just tracking birds.
Yeah, but for us, that would be really interesting. At the back there? Okay, so the question is, when you're trying to do these really big maps of trends, for example, and you're chopping the continent up into a little bit, what determines how big you have to chop it up? So it's kind of two things. One of them is just how much computational power you can lay your hands on at any one time. Normally to do that, you want to have a good relationship, typically with a big university that's got a supercomputer. And you're going to kind of try and either buy some or beg or borrow some time from them. If you've got, the more time you have, the bigger areas that you can analyze. So you don't need to chop it up as much. The other thing is how complicated the biological factors are that you're trying to get around. I can't overstate how careful you do need to be with citizen science data. You can get a few factors coming in that can make you think you've got a really strong pattern and you ain't got it. So what might be a good example of that? The fact, for example, that people go different places for the holidays. So it can suddenly seem that, the main coast suddenly is kind of, covered in birds during August and, July and August. Is that because there's, masses of birds coming in? Well, a little bit. But there's also a heck of a lot of bird watchers just arrived. When it gets cold, they'll be back down in Florida or something like that. So if you've got those sorts of effects, sometimes you have to put a square around, say, this part of the coast and say, this is wacky. We're going to have to fit some special effects to watch out for those bird watchers. Things that have similar effects is when all the leaves fall off trees. Birds get a lot easier to see, so deciduous woodlands can be tricky and things like that. Sure, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Is Cornell monetizing the Merlin app or eBird app to fund research or conservation projects? Because I can't imagine that there's another resource like this that gets as many users, or is it completely free? I mean, I know it's free, but is there a way that you're using money for projects?
That's a really good question. So, okay, here's our current business model. So, like Shoals, Cornell Lab has some people who like to give us money to make stuff happen. So you, for example, Shoals is really lucky that it's being given money to try to give people scholarships. So you can come here and learn a lot about marine biology. That's an amazing thing to be able to do. We also have supporters that part of the argument is if you support us, we will try and make our products, I guess they are products in some ways, free to the person that's using them. So anybody can use eBird, anybody can use Merlin, anybody can use BirdCast. Despite the fact we were calculating this the other day, how much money and how much time we put into Merlin in particular. And if you add up all that citizen science time, it's just, crazy numbers. But we believe at the moment that you want to be able to put, I often talk about putting the coolest technology into the hands of whoever wants it. And I believe that passionately. But like with all of these things, there is a kind of little slippery thing as well. Merlin, if you're all going to sign up to it tonight, I'm sure. When you first sign up to it, it does say, can we have your email address? If you give us you can give us any email address, to be honest. If you give us a completely rubbish one, then after about 5 days, it'll stop working because we'll figure that out. But if you give us your real email address, we will then send you information about the Cornell Lab and all of these sorts of things. Now that has become previously, when we wanted to have members of the lab, which are really the people that provide all this support, we would kind of look on, we would look at courses like this. Who came on this course? Do we know their email addresses? Let's send it to them. It was kind of quite a hard way of finding who might be interested in becoming a member for us. Merlin is now our #1 way of finding people that might want to support us. Now, most of those people might only support us. You could become a member of the lab for like $40 a year. Most people would do that. That's good for us. If you've got about 160,000 members, so that's quite a lot of money. But what's also in there, some people, that's how they discover the lab. And we discover them as well, just like with Shoals. You get someone coming over one day, they say, I can't believe that you've got all these students coming over and they're all mixing with each other. They get excited. That's our way of finding those sorts of supporters now. So we don't directly monetize Merlin, but those contacts is really our bread and butter, as we would say now. It's become really important for us.
One more question, maybe.
Okay, one more, better be a good one.
All right, so off the figure, like the 1.2 billion dots lit up, do you have the outliers and like false information that people are doing? What's the method?
Oh, you guys have got the best questions. Okay, so the question there was 1.2 billion data points. What about all the rubbish in there? There's bound to be outliers in there. In fact, we know that some people, probably not that many for something like eBird, but some people actually put, erroneous stuff in there because it's funny, or for whatever, they hate birds or something, whatever it is. I don't know. I don't know why they do it. I don't know. Hate goals. So we spend quite a lot of time trying to figure out how reliable observations are. One of the ways that we do that is that if you think about it, if any of us go bird watching, so I live in Ithaca. If I go for a walk in one of those gorges in Ithaca, I'm not the only person that's done that. I'm probably not even, I record it on eBird. I'm probably not even the only person that day. So we actually have a lot of information about what birds are in, Cascadia Gorge on any particular day. So if you go up there and you tell me you've seen 3 ostriches, a penguin, and goodness knows what, then we will pretty kind of go, I think he's not having the best day today. There's something going on. So we do quite a lot of that sort of thing where we try to figure out where there are unusual records coming in and why that might be. The other thing we do is if you said something like, you don't tell me there's an ostrich, I'd be really suspicious about that. But if you told me there was just a really kind of what good bird might you have seen? You see a cerulean warbler or something like that. We're just excited. Then we have, if it's an unusual species, or you say you see a lot of it, there's an actual human being that would get triggered. That actual human being would look and go, oh, it's kind of, it's early May, cerulean warbler, Cascadia, not impossible, but unlikely. They would personally contact you by email and say, tell me more about it. Now, usually the responses to that, they cover the whole, when someone says, did you see a cerulean warbler? Boy, you get the full range of responses to that sort of query. Some people tell you most vigorously, if I say I saw one, I did see one. Now that doesn't help us very much because it's like, well, either you're a very confident liar or you're mistaken. Most people provide more information. And during that process, sometimes it does work out that, oh, okay, the person says, oh, okay, maybe it wasn't a cerulean, you're right. Maybe it was a parallel warbler. I just saw a bit of blue and you're like, okay, well, cool. But sometimes it's, no, they really did see it. They show us photographs and all. So we do quite a lot of checking. And if you look at the other, this is getting a bit social media-like, of course. That's also kind of the sorts of processes that Facebook uses and Twitter uses as well. Now, we don't do as much of it at the moment, but as we get bigger, we're doing more of it. It's again, we have kind of citizen scientists, reviewers doing that for us. So we don't employ those people, but it's a bit like someone on Facebook or Twitter kind of moderating it. So we do some of that. So it's getting very kind of social sciencey to get to the sciencey, I would say. Lots of maths, lots of social sciences to try to do biology. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Has anyone in here actually used eBird to try to find a bird? I have. Yeah. So that's another example of like, we would add more data into it and then you would get many cerulean warblers. Anyway, all right. So everyone here, if you can just keep it down for a minute while we get off the call. Everyone here and online, please know that all of these talks throughout the entire summer are recorded. They're all on our website. Please feel free to share that with friends, families, colleagues. Their next rock talk is next Tuesday, same time, same place, where Dr. Andrea Boglamoni, some of you know her quite well here, is going to talk to us about the Shoals Seal program happening right here at Duck Island next door. All of the information about these talks is on our website, and you can sign up. When you leave the island, you can still join us on Zoom and come back virtually. So thanks for joining us here and online. Have a great night.